I'm in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam's economic and industrial hub, but some of you may know it under a different name, Saigon. Over the past few centuries, this city has been under the control of some very different parties, but there's one culture that's particularly left its mark here. I'm outside of Saigon City Hall, which happens to be modeled off of Paris's City Hall. And right around it is a boulevard that looks very much like the Champs-Élysées. So that's the Notre Dame of Saigon. I didn't know it was under renovation right now, but yeah, here's some stock footage of it instead. I'm in Vietnam because I want to understand the cuisine and identity of this place. A place with a tumultuous history and complex maze of different cultures. Even the names of the city I'm in, Saigon and Ho Chi Minh City, both have historical and political context. And the history of Vietnam is a two-way story. One of a people trying to consolidate this complex ethnic region into a single identity, and another of foreign powers trying to influence this land for their own gain. But I think out of all of these foreign influences, one of them really helped define modern Vietnamese cuisine. This dish isn't probably something you would envision from Vietnam, and it has beef, onions, and pate. Obviously, it's a baguette sandwich. The flavors, the way that the pork is marinated and the vegetables added into it, it's super Asian. The yolk makes it really extra creamy and sweet. The French began their colonization of this entire region in this very city. And though the French are now gone, they've left their mark on this city and the country's food. I want to see the clash of these two stories. One of a man dreaming to unify his people through food, and another of a powerful empire redesigning this country and its food to their liking. I want to see how these two stories collided, and how Vietnam not only endured, but conquered these external influences. How this country has been united with a culinary identity, and how Vietnam conquered French food.
Sooner or later, Vietnam will win its independence and have peace. North and South will once more be united.
So, I've been in Saigon for a few days now, and everywhere I keep seeing these carts that sell baguettes. These baguettes are everywhere. They're in almost every street corner. I've never seen this kind of concentration of bread in any other Asian country I've been to. Banh mi in Vietnamese pretty much just means bread, but it's most often used for baguettes, or more famously, these. This is banh mi tit, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Banh mi tit, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but basically it's banh mi with meat stuffing inside. So it's the most generic kind of banh mi out there. Wow, the pate here really sells it. And yeah, it just works really well. The French introduced baguettes to Vietnam early on during their colonization of here, but it started off as a luxury as wheat for bread was coming in from overseas. It wasn't until after World War II when people here started to mix in cheap rice flour with wheat to make the banh mi that's unique to Vietnam. And the rice flour actually made this bread fluffier, despite being very crispy on the outside. This is the most obvious mix of French cuisine into the Vietnamese palate. But banh mi here isn't just a sandwich. So this is a banh mi pha đao. I usually have it with like an entire stew and you dip the bread in, but this time they've separated the kind of like stew contents with the general like tripe, which is like beef organs. So I'm not exactly sure if I'm eating this correctly, but let's see. It's messy, but flavor-wise it's really nice. I hope I'm eating it correctly. There's this giant market in the middle of the city, which happens to be one of the oldest structures in Saigon, built by the French. This place started off as a floating market before it was taken over by the French, and it was moved further inland a few times to where it is now. But the story of this mixture of cuisine is more complex than just Vietnamese and French culture clashing. especially in a place like Saigon. And that's because this city isn't really originally Vietnamese. Vietnam and its culture really began up here in this northern region, where modern-day Hanoi is. Across centuries, these early Vietnamese cultures would eventually evolve into the Vietnam we know today. But down here, things were more turbulent. The earliest known settlement of Saigon started right here, where this Buddhist temple stands. It started off as a Funan temple in an ancient culture that is actually more inspired by cultures from the Indian subcontinent. Eventually, this southern region and the city was taken over by two other kingdoms, one which would eventually become modern-day Cambodia, and it wasn't until the late 1600s when the Vietnamese from the north took this land from Cambodia. The Vietnamese did this because they were driven by this concept of Nam Tien, the desire to expand their kingdom southward and unite the Vietnamese people of this region. One Vietnamese emperor, Minh Mang, would help capture this entire southern region, but this place had a very different history and climate from the north, not to mention many other ethnic groups beyond the Vietnamese. This means that the food of North and South Vietnam are notably different, even to this day. But Minh Mang wanted to unify these two cuisines into one Vietnamese culture. He believed that food would be the basis of a national identity for his vision of a united Vietnam. And he developed a huge plan to map Vietnamese cuisine for the future. But then, the French came along. The French would colonize this entire region, which includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But Vietnam was their first target, beginning with the French capture of Saigon. And from that point on, the French became a huge influence on the cuisine across Vietnam. This dish isn't probably something you would envision from Vietnam. This is bo ne, which essentially means dodging beef. I guess because you have to dodge the sizzling oil. This is a dish from the south, and it includes beef, onions, and pate, all of which are kind of very French. But it is from here in Vietnam, and I've never had it before, so let's give it a try. I'm gonna try to put everything into one bite. Ah, shit, that's good. I've never really had pate paste on meat itself. It gives it a really nice layer, a really smooth texture over the beef. It's so good. It kind of makes it almost a little bit sweet. And you can dip it with some banh, or bread. I'm in love with this pate. The French introduced many ingredients to Vietnam, from onions, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, and coffee. With them, they also brought food like pate, bread, wine, and butter. And when you list out all of these French traditions, you can start to easily find them everywhere in Vietnam. This is bánh pate so, which is another variation of Vietnamese French food. It's basically a pastry with meat filling, made with butter and onions, which are very French. But it also includes fish sauce, which is pretty Southeast Asian. The pate is really mushed together in this one. It's really interesting. It kind of looks like a sausage almost. Some of these influences are straight up obvious, like bang flan, which is essentially Vietnamese flan, and you can find it pretty much everywhere. I like the ice on top of it because Vietnam's a little bit hot. All of these dishes, despite the French influence, are Vietnamese. They represent Vietnam and the culture here. But remember Minh Mang, the emperor who wanted to unify his country through a clear, homogeneous Vietnamese identity? He had a plan to do that, and his vision was very different from the dishes we just saw. Minh Mang was a huge fan of Confucianism and the Han Dynasty in China, and he wanted to bring Chinese traditions to Vietnam. For one, he led a campaign that made everyone in the country eat with chopsticks. But one really unique way to distinguish food as Vietnamese was that this cuisine would correspond to the 5 elements. Oh yeah, unlike the West, Asia has 5 elements, by the way. They're wood, earth, fire, water, and metal. Avatar would have been a pretty different show.
Come on, metal.
This 5-element correspondence looks like this. Most Vietnamese dishes would include all of these traits, like having 5 colors. But again, this isn't really applicable to the modern Vietnamese experience, nor to the many ethnic groups that live within Vietnam that are now also Vietnamese. We found this little cafe in the middle of the city, and it serves one of my favorite coffees in the world, egg coffee. This coffee, which is dense and sweet, mixes Robusta coffee with sugar, butter, and yes, egg yolk. It's mostly a northern tradition. I had it the first time in 2019 when I went to Hanoi, and this amazing melange of ingredients creates a unique coffee that is truly Vietnamese. While the French brought coffee to Vietnam, it was created because the Vietnamese went to war with the French in the 1940s for their independence. During the war, there was a shortage of milk, and one hotel bartender decided to use egg to replace milk. This delicious coffee comes as a result of a brutal decade-long war that would end up with 2 Vietnams, a Soviet-backed North and US-backed South, which again brought in more outside influence. Eventually, after another brutal war, Vietnam was finally reunited. Now, politics aside, the North and South were still very culturally different. The next man to unify this country, Ho Chi Minh, realized that this country was just too diverse to bring together as a homogeneous identity. What's Vietnamese is what comes from the people who live here. Even if France or other cultures have influenced this place, the people here took outside traditions and adapted them to make Vietnamese cuisine stronger and more unique to this place. On the final day of my trip, I met with a Vietnamese friend to eat what's probably the defining dish of Vietnam, pho. But pho is everywhere, so I want to show you a different kind, one that's made with red wine.
No matter how clean it is, you always have to re-clean it. Just rub it in here.
Okay.
The girl was like, oh, this guy's a gentleman because it's really for the girl.
Really?
It's like a consideration.
So, this is Pho Bo Sot Vang.
Pho Bo Sot Vang.
Pho Bo Sot Vang.
Yeah, pretty good.
So it's essentially pho made with red wine, which essentially comes from a lot of French cooking traditions. Modern pho is believed to come from French influence, with even the name possibly coming from pho in portofeu. The charring of onions for pho is also very similar to the roasting of onions for portofeu, which makes it different from other Asian noodle soups.
The way that pho is cooked in the north and the south is quite different. In general, the south side we eat things that is more sweeter. So I can say that this place is, I think the cooks is from French is stringy. Usually they just put the raw meat into the boiled soup, and that's how you eat, right? But this plate, I think they cook it stir-fried.
Oh.
So it's a different way of cooking it. So that's why I can taste a little bit of the beef fat in the soup because of the stir-fry. That's quite interesting. I think someone tried putting wine to the soup and they're like, oh, this works. So that's how the people started to have it as a variation of pho. But personally, I don't like so far. I had a few times, but
You like the original one?
I like the original. I don't know, somehow it's make the taste not pho, like for me. So
It's pretty different, yeah. I mean, the noodles is pho, but the broth is kind of closer to, what's it, bún bò? I came to one of the most important sites in Vietnam. While the Vietnamese people and culture began up in the north, it's really down here in Saigon that has shaped this modern country. It's here where the Vietnamese mixed with the Cham and Khmer, where the French began their colonization, and where a young man boarded a boat to France to start a 30-year journey to find independence for his people. Ho Chi Minh left Vietnam at this very spot to essentially allow this country to be what it is today. Despite how volatile Vietnamese history is and how many countries have tampered with the culture here, the cuisine that exists today is a product of resilience and an experience that now unifies the Vietnamese people. And in the end, maybe Minh Minh actually got his dream of a national Vietnamese cuisine, just not in the way he'd expect. And a lot of it is thanks to this city.